Good morning and good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Vladimir Olegovich Rakhmanin. I am regional representative of FAO for Europe and Central Asia with the office in Budapest. So I'm talking to you now from Budapest. Distinguished speakers, panelists, dear participants, it is an honor for me to welcome you to our regional webinar on agri-food trade policy in Europe and Central Asia during COVID-19 pandemic. It is an honor to open this unique session as it is organized in unique collaboration between WTO and FAO. So let me also welcome our colleagues from WTO and thank Mr. Edvini Kesi, Director of Agriculture and Commodities Division, for moderating the discussion today. Thank you very much. The webinar is the 7th in the series that our regional office for Europe and Central Asia is doing after pandemic hit us. They aim to facilitate multi-stakeholder dialogue on the impact of COVID-19 through knowledge sharing and exchange of experience among relevant actors in the region. We have explored the impacts of COVID-19 on the food systems as a whole, on extension and advisory services, impact on smallholders and family farms, on social protection, research and innovation, and migration in the past 6 sessions. Today, we focus on agri-food trade policy. And I can tell you that it's really important, the issues. I just came out from the meeting of the ministers of agriculture of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with which FAO is developing cooperation. And this is a big grouping which unites China, India, Pakistan, Russia, all Central Asia. And the ministers, when they are sharing their views on the pandemic, trade was among the priorities. Trade in agricultural products is very important to all of them, and they want to they want to expand this issue and to get better understanding. So I'm saying policymakers are now grappling with uncertainties surrounding the impacts of COVID-19 on food supply, demand, and trade. They are identifying the most appropriate measures to ensure that this pandemic does not translate into food crisis. Nonetheless, when we apply control and mitigating measures, we should avoid establishing barriers to trade or disrupting domestic and global food supply chains. Where and if measures are necessary, we expect them to be consistent with WTO rules and be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. FAO has been continuously monitoring the functioning of food supply chains in Europe and Central Asia. Despite disruptions of food supply chains, food systems in the region have shown resilience, and the major food crisis has so far been averted. However, the financial situation of the agri-food sector in the region is complicated, and you will discuss it in depth today. This joint webinar, joint between FAO and WTO, provides a platform for discussing the significance of trade in the region and the impact that different types of domestic support measures may have on trade in Europe and Central Asia. Our speakers and panelists will focus on 2 key issues. First, trade and domestic support measures implemented during the pandemic, the problems these attempted to address, and their effectiveness. And second one, the role of trade policy for tackling short-term impacts while pursuing long-term objectives. In other words, immediate trade responses that build back better the agriculture sector through agricultural trade. In 10 days, Uzbekistan will be hosting FAO Regional Conference for Europe and Central Asia. And your discussion, your inputs will be incorporated into our discussion at the ministerial level at the conference. And I wish you a very productive and fruitful discussion. And I feel sorry that I cannot stay with you, but I'm absolutely sure that it would be a very interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to your conclusions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Vladimir. Greetings to everyone for joining us for this webinar from wherever you are. I understand we have some people joining us from further afield, not only in Europe, so whether it is afternoon or evening, good evening to you all. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this FAO WTO webinar on Agri-Food Trade Policy in Europe and Central Asia during COVID-19 and beyond. As Validemia pointed out, my name is Edwin Kese, and I'm the Director of the Agriculture and Commodities Division of the World Trade Organization. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a platform for sharing information and views on trade policies that have been implemented to address the impacts of COVID-19 on agriculture in Europe and Central Asia. It has been prepared in close collaboration between the FAO and WTO, two institutions which have been heavily involved in the discussions about policy actions needed to ensure stability in the agricultural sector. The webinar would provide us with an opportunity to take stock and analyze the different policy measures that have been implemented by countries with the aim of supporting an informed dialogue on trade policy at the multilateral level. Although the webinar focuses mostly on multilateral action, it also explores trade issues that are of interest to analysts and policymakers in Europe and Central Asia. Let me share some technical information on the arrangements for this meeting. Language options, English-Russian interpretation is available, and you can switch language by clicking on the small global icon at the bottom of the page. We are expecting your questions and comments in writing. For this, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. Please do not use the chat for this purpose. Also, the proceedings are being recorded and will be broadcast on YouTube. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Gloria Abraham Peralta of Costa Rica, to present her statement. Madam Peralta is the chairperson of the WTO Agriculture Negotiations. Before she took up her post as ambassador of Costa Rica to the WTO, she was office director for Mexico of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, and also the first woman ever to be appointed as Minister of Agriculture and Husbandry in Costa Rica, a post she occupied between 2010 and 2014. Ambassador Peralta will talk about the importance of agriculture and trade in these unprecedented times, the dilemmas facing government, and the lessons to be learned. As we normally say, no one should waste a crisis. And I think policymakers all over international organizations do not want to waste this crisis. They want to learn lessons from that, which would better equip us in the future to deal with such scenarios, should they occur once again. So, Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you, Edwini and Vladimir. It's a great pleasure for me to join this webinar. The outbreak of the pandemic sent a strong reminder of the importance of the agricultural sector in our countries. Among the very first measures taken, most of the government declared the sector as an essential activity and adopted measures to help agricultural producers and to facilitate agricultural trade. The pandemic also highlighted the interdependence of our countries when it comes to ensuring global food security. The role of international trade remains crucial. Policy measures in one country may have significant impact in other countries. In the case of the Europe and Central Asia region, where agricultural accounts for more than 10% of the GDP on several countries, in some cases more than 40% of merchandise exports, the importance of the sector as well as the interdependence with trading partners cannot be overstated. While agricultural has shown resilience with an economic and trade performance that had resisted better than other sectors, and with abundant stocks and key staples, the sector faces many uncertainties, due notably of the severe economic downturn on the risk of a second wave of coronavirus. Therefore, this webinar is very timely. We start to have a well-informed perspective and can now take a few steps back to look at the measures adopted and analyze their impact on the agricultural sector in the region and elsewhere. The speaker after me will get into more details of these measures. Therefore, I will say only a few words to introduce the topic. We have seen different phases of measures put in place since the outbreak of the pandemic. At first, governments aimed at addressing the most urgent concerns of saving lives and ensuring food security of their population by adopting lockdown measures and measures to facilitate food imports through tariff reductions and easier import procedures. Some countries also resorted to trade restrictive measures such as export restrictions for the fear of shortage of food when needed. We also saw an increase in stockpiling. After this initial phase, government moved quickly to adopt policies to help farmers cope with these exceptional circumstances and to mend broken supply chains. During this phase, many governments relaxed lockdown measures, removed several export restrictions, and introduced fiscal incentives to another domestic support measure to support the agricultural sector. However, the pandemic has continued to spread, and now many countries are seeing again a significant rise of COVID cases. The economic crisis is threatening to the food security and livelihoods at the most vulnerable populations. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund said last Friday that the global economic contraction caused by the pandemic is the largest in the last 80 years. While overall the perspective for the global economy has improved, the difficulties are far from over. Therefore, governments are facing again with the dilemma of keeping their economies open and agricultural production going, and at the same time protecting the health of their population. There are many lessons to be learned, and I'm sure that the webinar today will highlight many of them. These lessons are not only about the policy measures, but also about mutual trust. Trust that you can rely on the markets you sell your produce. Trust that you can procure your food you need. This is why the disciplines of WTO Agreement of Agriculture are so important. They strive to ensure that the food is produced efficiently and can flow from producers to consumers as seamlessly as possible and at affordable prices. As the proverb goes, don't look where you fall, but where you slept. You have to look back and pick the best measures to ensure food security of all. I would like to conclude with some key messages. First, governments need to protect their population health. To help the economic, agricultural, and other workers need to feel safe when they go to work. Second, governments need to ensure the food security of their population. For this, improved predictability is a must. Producers will need to know that they can sell their products domestically or internationally, and consumers should be assured that they can access affordable, nutritious food at all times. International trade remains a crucial component of food security. The food security of 3 billion people depends on it. Third, government must avoid measures that could lead to food shortages in the future and be mindful of the impacts of their measures on other countries. The food security on one country should not come at the expense of another one. This is why many countries have been calling for any emergency measures designed to tackle COVID-19 to be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary, and not create unnecessary disruptions to supply chains. As the chair of agricultural negotiations, I'm working together with WTO members, including countries from the region, to further strengthen the WTO agricultural rulebook, sought to reduce distortion and enhance the much needed predictability to both producers and consumers. Countries in this region have a big role to play in taking the agricultural negotiations forward. I count on your support, and I wish you an insightful debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Abraham, and thank you for highlighting the interdependence of countries as far as having stability in world agricultural markets is concerned. And I think you made some very valid points that it needs cooperation if countries are to ensure food security, not for their own, but for other countries as well. Because invariably, if countries were to adopt protectionist measures, these measures may also affect the food security of other countries. So thank you for highlighting the importance of cooperation among countries, and also the fact that the WTO rulebook needs to be updated to ensure that distortions are reduced, to ensure that countries are able to produce more food sustainably to feed the growing world population. So with that, I will now invite Dr. Maximo Torero Cullen of the FAO, who is the chief economist of the FAO. He joined the FAO in January 2019 as Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development. Maximo will talk about the role of trade and provide an overview of temporary policy changes induced by the pandemic. He would also discuss how FAO is supporting its members in dealing with COVID-19. So with these brief words, Maximo, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie, and thank you all for this kind invitation. The correlation between trade and expansion and economic growth is generally well recognized. Countries with higher rates of GDP growth also tend to have higher rates of growth in trade as a share of output. And trade is normally accompanied by a greater competition, economies of scale, knowledge, and technology transfers, which are key ingredients for the productivity improvements necessary to ensure economic growth. And even more, if we allocate resources in the best possible way, that means that we are also going to assure some sustainability. For these reasons, WTO recent revisions to the projections in global merchandise trade volumes is good news. The expected decline of 9.2% in 2020 is smaller than the figure projected in April. But likewise, the IMF, as you can see in my screen, has bring a new estimation of GDP growth decline, which has changed between -5.2 in June 2020 to -4.4 in 2020. And this revision reflects better than earlier anticipated economic performance in the second quarter of the year. And for 2021, the global growth is projected to be 5.2. So this is an improvement, especially because of big countries like China, which has now become in positive growth when we are expecting close to zero in the previous projection. But despite this, if we look at the large output losses because of what we are observing, and here you have in the blue bar, the world aggregate losses, which are around $11 trillion in 2020. And in 2020-2025, it will be close to $28 trillion. And in the yellow bar, you're observing the world per capita thousands of dollars. So the massive amount of output losses are huge. And this has a consequence. No? This is not going to go for free. We have to pay, and trade, of course, could be affected because of this. So while the improvements in the projections of the decrease of GDP growth are positive developments, in their under-optimistic scenarios, the economic downturn caused by the COVID-19 pandemic could erase decades of progress gained against poverty. The bank is projecting more than 100 million people moving to extreme poverty, and lead to also increasing in levels of undernourishment. And our own projections are saying that we could be between 83 to 132 million people moving into undernourishment. So countries will be facing significant periods of recession, and that's where we are concerned, because this could create a problem of access to food. In difference to 2007, 2008 food crisis, the challenge today is not of food availability, but of food access. And in fact, international food markets have proven to be resilient relative to other sectors of the economy, thanks to the ample global supplies. So measures to control or mitigate the spread of the virus have placed under stress some of the segments of the food supply chain, especially because of the lockdowns. We brought some logistical problems. No? So, for example, restricted visa services affected the mobility of labor force, which mainly affected high-value commodities, but also, of course, affected perishable products. And in some cases, we had some logistical problems in terms of the flow of vessels because of the lockdowns in the ports. So, what we are now looking at is how we can resolve this problem. Because of some countries imposing some trade restrictions. So it was imposed in few countries. There were some export restrictions in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia. And many of the export bans have been transformed into export quotas, and most of them have been already repealed. But import restrictions mainly address the trade of live animals, and that's also something that we have to be looking very carefully. But as a result of that, if we compare 2007 and 2020, in 2007, we had 33 countries putting export restrictions of different forms, which imply close to 20% of the share of the global trade. Today, in the 2020, we had a maximum of 22 countries, which at that point imply a little bit higher than 5% of the share of global trade. And today we are in zero, which basically we are not affecting trade. But again, that does not mean that the problem is resolved. And one of the pending issues is the issue of disruption in maritime transportation, which could affect trade. So if you look at this map, in orange are countries which still cannot allow crew changes. So vessels are moving, but they arrive to the limit of having their crews in the sea. If these countries like Argentina, for example, which is a huge supplier of cereals, cannot change vessels, it could affect the Northern Africa part where you are a net importer of cereals. Again, if they don't resolve this, could be fixed. So these are issues that we need to look carefully. And in high value commodities, the case of Peru and Colombia. So issues that we need to look carefully to avoid any uncertainty in the markets and to avoid any potential increase in restrictions. So what we are observing is an improvement, but still we are not out of the problem. And that's something that we need to look at very, very, very carefully. Now, our recent flagship publication, The State of Agricultural Commodity Markets 2020, estimates that 1/3 of all agricultural food exports are traded within global value chains. That means that they move at least three countries. So primary agricultural commodities are essentially exported, processed into food products, which in turn are re-exported. As such, global value chains involve closer links between various actors compared to other forms of trade. As a result, supply chain disruptions as well as trade restrictions can cascade through the different parts of the value chain with adverse impacts affecting multiple countries. And that's what we can observe in this graph for agriculture and for food beverages. So the global value chains are growing, not at the velocity we would have expected, but again, they could affect several sectors and several countries if we impose those trade restrictions. And this is a map showing how many countries trade more than 35% of the food through global value chains. And look at sub-Saharan Africa, significant amount of countries also in South America and in Europe. So again, we need to look at this carefully when we look at any potential trade restriction or trade barrier. And also, we know that a 10% increase in agricultural global value participation can lead to an increase in agricultural labor productivity of over 1% on average. And this is for agriculture and for food beverages. Now, what do we need to do, because we want this to be inclusive and we not want this to include markets. And basically, the main causes of the disruptions on the supply side were basically because of the lockdowns, which create logistical, transport, and trade restrictions. But on the demand side, our major concern right now, as I mentioned, is the recession, and how much this will affect capacity of purchasing, and how much this will affect the well-being of households. And that's something that we need to be very careful. If we observe at the impact of agri-food imports, for example, and here I'm showing cereals, fruits and nuts, vegetables, live animals, fish, trees, and cut flowers from March to May. As you can see, in the case of cereals, fruits and nuts, and vegetables, the results are mixed. They were positive at the beginning, but now in May they are negative. But in the case of live animals, and fish and trees and flowers, it's still very negative, which are showing some heterogeneity in the potential impacts of imports. If we look at some countries, also we see some heterogeneity. The red line shows 2020, and the black line, dotted line, shows average 2018 to 2019. Look at the evolution for New Zealand, for example, and how imports are increasing, but exports are still not increasing. In South Africa, we see a recovery, but still in imports we are lagged. And in the case of Sri Lanka, we see a significant recovery in exports, but not, and also a convergence in the case of imports. So things are changing depending on the situation each of the countries are facing in each of different parts of the regions. And why is this? Is because we are in this type of a situation. We are in a situation where basically we are in a very risky situation because COVID-19 is still there. We have not resolved the problem. And if we are not careful and we don't put, as it was mentioned by the previous speaker, the food safety measures in place and the health safety measures in place, although we activate our economic activity, then we could fall. And that's something that we need to avoid, and that's something where we need to put significant effort. What we are trying to do at FAO to help our countries is moving on 4 key accelerators. First is data and big data to get real-time information so that they can make proper decisions. Second is innovation, so that we are flexible to adjust to the situation. Digital technologies has become a significant source of innovation to respond to the COVID-19 and to the physical distance. And technology, which is there, but we need to bring some more solid evidence. But if these 3 accelerators can move along by themselves very fast, we need also to bring the complements. And the complements are governance, human capital, and institutions. And if you look, the arrow goes in a different direction. It's not clockwise. And the reason is because these could grow very fast and could accelerate very fast. But it could be that we need to decelerate a little bit so that we do it properly, so that in the medium term and long term, we really grow faster and sustainable. So it's very important to bring into the complements, and that's the 4 accelerators we're trying to bring in each of the countries. We are working through our different initiatives, like the hand-in-hand initiatives in the country. So with that, let me thank you again. And I think countries in Europe and Central Asia are important players in the global agricultural market and can contribute considerably to the fight against hunger and malnutrition, but we need to work hard to avoid any uncertainties in the market today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maximo, for this presentation, which underscored the need for policymakers to shun complacency. And I think you are very much on point there, especially given that most of these predictions or projections were made before the rising cases of COVID. So obviously, if this is not brought under control, then I think the figures given by both the WTO, which, as you rightly predicted, recently said that global trade will shrink by 9.2% and increase by 7.2%. But this will be quite optimistic if we do have, rising cases of COVID. So it is very important for countries to learn the lessons that collaboration is still needed. And some of the figures you gave were quite startling in terms of the number of people who are facing malnourishment. So it's underscored the need for us to continue global cooperation efforts. And I think the FAO's work is quite great in the sense of informing policymakers as to what is needed, the fact that GVCs are important, that they need to be more inclusive so that other countries, particularly developing countries, can participate. So I think with that, we turn to our next speaker, and that is Professor Alan Matthews. Professor Alan Matthews is a Professor Emeritus of European Agricultural Policy at Trinity College, Dublin, in Ireland. He has been a member of 3 WTO dispute settlement or arbitration panels. He is the former president of the European Association of Agricultural Economists and is currently a member of Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council. So Professor Matthews, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll just start my screen. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion with you all this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are. And I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of trade liberalization and protectionism, because although this is a very long-standing debate amongst policymakers and amongst economists, amongst those involved in the food chain, I think the framing of this debate has taken on a different dimension following the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to discuss this very much from the European Union perspective. We do have Tassos Haniotis on the panel, who will certainly be able to give you a deeper perspective on this than I do. But I think it complements some of the excellent work that FAO has been doing in terms of its updates on the food situation in Europe and Central Asia, which focuses more on the program countries. So I have two messages or two issues that I would like to share with you in the time that I have. One is just to look at how the pandemic has impacted the food system within the European Union and the response of the European Union to date to the dislocations that we have experienced. And then secondly, to look at the ensuing debate around the relocalization of food chains, which I think is, as I say, this new framing of the role of trade in food security policies. Maximo gave you exactly this chart for a number of other countries. So this is how trade has been affected for the European Union, both internally, which is the brown line at the top, using exports as the indicator, and also in terms of extra EU trade, which is the blue line is exports and the red line is imports. And I've highlighted there with the vertical line March of this year, which of course is when the lockdowns started in a serious way. So like all other countries in the region, the pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns affected food systems both on the supply side and on the demand side. So on the supply side, we had first of all, transport dislocations and also restrictions on the movement of labor, which particularly affected seasonal workers required for agricultural production, particularly the harvesting of fruits and vegetables. We had the closure of processing plants, particularly meat processing plants. There seems to have been, in all countries, hotspots of COVID outbreaks, particularly amongst workers in meat factories. On the demand side, dislocations in terms of very rapid shifts in demand as the food service sector, so that's restaurants, cafes, canteens and so on, closed down, and demand shifted to supermarkets. For a very short period, maybe a day or two, because of the uncertainty around food availability, we did see some pictures of empty supermarket shelves, but more as a result of panic buying and hoarding than I think any real constraints on supply at that period. But still, certainly the shifts required from selling produce through the food service sector directly to consumers through retail. Also a growing interest, it appears, in terms of direct sales. So box deliveries, direct deliveries to households. In terms of the reaction on agricultural markets, I'd say these have been varied. There have been some markets where we had very severe effects. So, for example, the COVID pandemic arose precisely at the sort of peak of the flour season for Dutch flour producers. So there was very significant losses there. Also amongst potato growers, because a lot of potatoes are sold as French fries in fast food restaurants, and of course they were closed. We've also seen major drops in prices for wine producers in some countries. Although in general, agricultural markets within the European Union have remained fairly resilient. Yes, prices are lower, but certainly perhaps not as much as we might have expected from the size of the shock that we have experienced. There's also been some increase in food prices, so margins along the chain have increased, although food prices have fallen back as the lockdown has eased, at least until recently. So all of those supply and demand shocks together, in a sense, are reflected in the graph here, showing trends in agri-food trade. You'll see that compared to some of the trends which Maximo showed for some individual countries, the impacts have been relatively mild, particularly with respect to trade with third countries, so the bottom two lines. Yes, clearly there has been a reduction, but within the bounds, you could say, of variability that we've seen in the past. The reduction in intra-EU trade, perhaps surprisingly, has been even more marked. But we see also, as the lockdowns began to ease there during the summer period, we see trade beginning to recover. So against that background, what has been the EU response to this initial phase of the pandemic? And here it's important perhaps to underline, for those not fully familiar with the way the EU, which has a common agricultural policy, so it's funded centrally for all of the member states. But the EU budget is much more restrictive than budgets in an ordinary country, for two reasons. First of all, unlike other governments, the EU cannot actually borrow money. Now, that may well change in the light of the pandemic, but as of this point in time, if there is a crisis, the EU simply cannot go to the market, to the financial markets, and try to borrow money. That's simply not allowed under the rules. So it would require member states to provide additional funds to the EU budget. But here there are also limits, because there's a sort of a medium-term ceiling which sets a maximum that can be spent in any particular year. And because there were already significant demands on the EU budget for other COVID-19 priorities, there was actually very little in the EU budget left to fund emergency measures in the agricultural sector. So what you saw were some efforts to permit member states to make earlier payments to farmers that would have been made anyway. Relaxation of some rules allowing producers in producer groups to come together to attempt to control the supply of products to the market as a way of trying to maintain prices. And one of the instruments in the EU's toolbox is what we call aid for private storage, which essentially is paying food processors, so dairies, meat factories, and so on, to actually store produce for a temporary period to keep it off the market in order to keep prices relatively high. Of course, that's a temporary measure, and it would be expected that these supplies would eventually be released. But the amount of money that was made available for this, 80 million, is really, I would have to say, peanuts in the context of overall agricultural spending in the EU. By far more important was the EU giving member states permission, if you like, to use their own funds to support farmers. And this was done through what we call the temporary framework for state aid. So this relaxed the rules. Normally there's quite strict rules on what additional state aid member states can give to farmers. As I say, this is a common policy within the European Union, but these rules were relaxed. And member states were indeed encouraged to provide emergency assistance where they felt this was necessary. Of course, when you allow that kind of response, you immediately worry about the impact on trade and on production distortion. Within the European Union, we have what we call the single market, and clearly if farmers in one country were receiving more generous support from their governments than farmers in another country, then you immediately fear that there could be a distortion of competition. And of course, for countries outside the European Union, perhaps not in the same position to be able to support their farmers as we can in Europe, there's also a fear of trade distortion. And I suppose it's important to point out here that there were restrictions on the way in which aid, this emergency aid, could be provided to European farmers. And specifically, it could not be linked either to prices or to the quantities that farmers supplied. So that would, for those of you familiar with WTO rules, that would very much fit in with the idea of sort of decoupled income support, and really intending to limit market distortions. So I think that would be, that was a positive element of the way in which the EU responded to the crisis. Nonetheless, the amounts of money have been very substantial. What I've listed on this slide is the amounts of assistance that the European Union has notified to the WTO up to middle of September of this year. And it amounts to almost 3.8 billion euros. And indeed, that's an underestimate for various reasons. First of all, it doesn't count what we call in Europe de minimis aid, which is relatively small amounts of aid that member states are able to give without notifying the Commission, so that they don't show up in these figures. And these are also emergency aid schemes that are specifically directed at farmers and therefore notified to the Committee on Agriculture. But you'll notice that some big member states, Germany, France, Spain, for example, don't appear in this list. And it's very possible that they have supported their farmers through more general aid schemes, perhaps directed at small and medium-sized enterprises in general, not specifically agricultural enterprises. So I think this 3.8 billion is probably an underestimate. So it illustrates that, yes, we have seen really a remarkable shift in terms of support to agriculture within Europe during this pandemic. Let me now turn just to the other message or issue that I wanted to discuss with you, because we have seen a rise in support for this idea of more local food production, because this is seen as a way of improving the resilience of food systems and thus leading to greater food security. And just to give some examples, for example, in Poland, you had government ministers, in a sense, shaming supermarkets who were selling imported milk and saying, look, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be supporting local production. In countries like Bulgaria and the Czech Republic, in fact, Bulgaria introduced a law saying that supermarkets had to buy a minimum of Bulgarian produce, and at least 90% of their milk and dairy products should be of Bulgarian origin. Romania was the only country which introduced, if you like, a classical trade policy measure. It introduced an export restriction on cereal exports. But that was removed actually within a week, partly because of pressure from their own farm groups, and also, of course, it's illegal within the European Union to introduce trade policy measures of that kind. But what I sort of want to highlight here is that the measures that we're discussing when we talk about this idea of relocalizing food chains are not necessarily the sort of traditional trade policy measures of import tariffs and export restrictions. It's very much more trying to put pressure on actors in the food chain, supermarkets, food processors, to buy local, if you like, rather than imported produce. And I put this phrase here, which I don't know how familiar it is to listeners, but gastro-nationalism, this idea that consumers in all countries, it's a very common phenomenon, always think that their own country's produce is best. Either it's more wholesome, it's safer to eat. There's always this bias in favor of local foods. And that, of course, is something which farm groups and food actors are well aware of and often use that in their marketing chain. So, for example, supermarkets where I live will advertise that the meat that they sell is all produced within the country. But we see a lot more official support, if you like, to rally around the flag and to purchase local in the context of the response to the pandemic. And of course, there are many reasons why consumers will want to consume and to purchase local foods. But the question which I think we should think about for a moment is, are these local food systems actually more resilient, which is the argument that is often made. So just to say a word about what we mean by resilience. And it seems to me a resilient food system is one that minimizes, if you like, exposure to risks in the first place. In other words, the vulnerability to external shocks. But if these do arise, then a resilient food system is one that is able to cope with these shocks in a way that restores production within a reasonable period of time. And of course, vulnerability to risk is perceived to be greater, not least during the COVID pandemic, because food supplies, the vulnerability depending on globalized food supplies is perceived to be a greater risk because they depend on functioning international transport networks, and these were restricted in the early stages of lockdown. Of course, if a food business decides to limit its sourcing of foods just to local foods, it may be trading off this vulnerability to disruption of international supply chains with increasing its vulnerability to local supply shocks. Because, of course, with climate change, exposure to greater weather extremes, the potential for invasion of pests and diseases and so on, local food can also be vulnerable to major shocks. And the message seems to be that globalized food systems are not only more efficient, I think most of us would probably accept that, but also promote greater food security because they are actually more resilient. Now, we'd like to be able to present sort of empirical evidence for this, but of course we don't yet have studies looking back at the relative impact of the shock on local food supply chains and globalized chains. But we can do model results. And here I just want to draw your attention to recent work done at the OECD, where they have compared two stylized versions of the global economy. So one is the, if you like, the world as we know it, this interconnected global world. And the other is a more localized regime where they deliberately try to restrict these economic trade flows so that the world is less interconnected than it is today. So these are the two baselines. And then they ask, well, what would happen if we expose these two different worlds to the same external shock? And they try to simulate the COVID-19 shock. And they do that by sort of artificially increasing the costs of trade by this 10% figure. And I think the results are really interesting because, first of all, not surprisingly perhaps, the so-called localized world, this less interconnected world, has lower economic activity, lower GDP, and importantly, lower food production than the more interconnected world. So that's the efficiency loss, if you like, which I think would probably be understood by most people. But also the localized world, because it had fewer substitution possibilities, it actually was less stable. And there was greater variability in prices, in production, and in incomes amongst farmers in that localized world in response to the same shock. And I think that's an important message, that there isn't a trade-off necessarily between efficiency and stability or resilience. So how can we strengthen the food system resilience through trade? It's clear that the pandemic has increased, risk aversion amongst policymakers, and there's an understandable dependence, perhaps, to an understandable reaction to reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. And indeed, if there was this trade-off between efficiency and resilience, and you become more risk averse, you might be prepared to give up some efficiency, to take a hit in terms of lower output, if it actually resulted in greater confidence that your food supply was secure. But what we observe from the modeling results is that is an artificial trade-off. It simply it does not exist. But of course, we do need to think about how we can strengthen the globalized food system. Not necessarily replace it, but think about ways of overcoming, some of the weaknesses which we have observed in recent months. And it seems to me the key here is diversification. So what led to a lot of the debate about localization was the awareness that we were relying on just one supplier, usually China, for a lot of the personal protective equipment, which was so needed in the early stages of the pandemic. So face masks, dressings, respirators, and so on. And it was that reliance on a single supplier which was the issue, rather than the fact that single supplier was a third country, rather than perhaps a single factory in your own country, which would could be equally problematic. So the ways in which we can encourage diversification, avoid dependence on just one supplier, I think is an important lesson from the crisis. And I would just end by saying that, unfortunately, the current lack of confidence in the multilateral institutions, and particularly the WTO, may encourage policy making to move in a regrettable direction, and could lead us into a lose-lose situation for the world as a whole. So I do think, the efforts that are being made to try to rebuild the institutions of the WTO and to get it back on its feet is really important in terms of underpinning future resilience of food systems. So thank you for that opportunity to share these thoughts.
Thank you, Alan, for this comprehensive presentation. I think it's quite good that you showed the policy responses of the European Union and the fact that the impact has not been as significant as feared initially, and also spending some time on the debate between localized food production and global. Obviously, from the WTO perspective, we would like what you had said about the need to strengthen multilateral approach, or the multilateralized system. I think we believe that is the way to go. And obviously, what you noted, that the current lack of effort, and I think Ambassador Peralta is doing her best to try to move the negotiations forward, so we are supporting her as much as possible. As you know, we all know agriculture is very, very important for many WTO members, and most members are determined to make progress in the 12th Ministerial Conference, which is likely to take place in June. So thanks for those points. And I think with this, I think we move to the second part of the webinar, and we are going to have a panel discussion, and we would have three panelists. They would be focusing more, they will provide views on the role of trade in the region, as well as from two different perspectives. And we also like to focus on the threats and opportunities for trade under COVID, which Alan spoke about, and Maximo as well, and as well Gloria, and also discuss the strengths and weaknesses of trade in the region pre-COVID-19. So I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists. So we have Tassos Haniotis, who is Director of Strategy Simplification and Policy Analysis, DG for Agriculture and Rural Development. We have Azamat Askuruli, Vice Minister, Ministry of Trade and Integration of Kazakhstan. We have Alexandr Zemodaya, Director of Department on Multilateral and Bilateral Trade Agreements of the Ministry. And I think we would have questions. I would invite my colleagues basically to focus. We have 2-3 minutes, and I think if you will be very brief. So the first question goes to Tassos. Alan Matthews spoke about the measures that the EU has been putting in place to assist its agricultural sector. Among the measures, which ones in your view have turned out to be the most efficient, and how long do you think these measures are needed? Is Tassos there?
Yes, I'm here.
Good.
Okay, good. Sorry. Thanks to Alan for so comprehensively covered the issue, and thanks also for the opportunity to interact with you. Very briefly, in the European Union, since we have 27 member states, challenges were different. So one should not clearly identify one measure over the other, but look at 3 different dimensions. When it comes to demand measures, clearly what we have seen there is a very strong focus on shifts on demand patterns, especially at the time that restaurants were totally closed. So a very significant shift of demand for food at the household level. And here the measures that were more important were in the member states that of course had the financial opportunity to do that, measures that supported people that were temporarily losing their job, because that's an important element that we tend to forget. The European Union is a relatively healthy region in the world, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own problems inside in terms of uneven distribution of wealth. So the support to those that needed to be able to purchase food was very important. On the supply side, the problems we had were relatively minor and solved relatively fast, except for sectors that faced perishability issues in the beginning. The most important measure, the most effective one, were the green corridors, the very fast response of the European Union in opening ways of trading food within the Union, and thus bypassing the bottlenecks that we saw taking place early on. And finally, a last point that revealed some of the weaknesses of the system, which has overall been pretty resilient, is the issue of seasonal workers. This is what complicated, especially at the early stages of COVID, the situation, and we still now that we're in the second wave see that there are some problems in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Tassos, for the very brief remarks and also for the comprehensive response. So now we move on to Alexandr, and I'll just pose the question. Ukraine is a major agricultural producer as well as an exporter. Can you tell us what were the challenges facing food trade in Ukraine and other countries in the region that became more pronounced during the pandemic? What measures have you adopted to address these challenges?
Thank you. I'm glad to be the part of this discussion, and I also pretty much enjoyed all 3 presentations from the speakers, because I believe at least 80% of all topics and things which I marked to describe the Ukrainian situation already was in 3 previous presentations. So thank you for our speakers. From Ukrainian perspective, we had a number of things which we faced during this year. We understand that in this time, while all trade are not so intensive for Ukraine, it's pretty important to show the sustainability of supply from our country. And we appreciate that instrument which were presented, I believe, 8 years ago by FAO together with J20 AMIS board, which is extremely useful, and we continue to communicate, and the information which we are distributed inside the AMIS was extremely important, because a number of countries during especially spring part of the year made a number of measures, restrictive measures in trade. And you understand that Ukraine in a Black Sea region, one of numbers of suppliers, means that as far as neighboring countries make some any measures, it's stressful for our trade as well. So from our perspective, we try to avoid trade restrictions. We try to show on a political level that we are a sustainable partner, and we pay a lot of attention to the national and regional balances. Together with also International Grain Council, we also made a number of intervention about balances inside the region. We also have a best practice. I believe the best practice in communication is a communication between businesses, traders and producers, and which also gives us a chance not to goes to harder restrictive measures in trade. We had just one particular case of export restrictions, but it was a rather reflection, because this buckwheat market is dependent from supply from abroad. So we are an important country at the moment. And another big thing was that during the year we had a more or less a stable resource market, because we are also important country from the point of resources, fertilizers and labor, and so we just go through this year more or less quiet. And from other side, we had also a number of stresses. Climatic, we have a dirty, so it was another big challenge for us. So briefly.
Thank you very much. Now we turn to Azamat, and besides being a large exporter of grains, Kazakhstan is at the same time a net importer of other agricultural products. Did you have the pressure from COVID to increase domestic production and or rely less on imports from countries in the region and elsewhere? And I think this goes back to Alan's presentation, whether we should have localized food production of global. So if we can have your thoughts on this question, Azamat.
Thank you very much, these distinguished guests, the webinar participants. On behalf of the Kazakhstan government, I would like to take this opportunity to thank WTO and Food and World Organization of the United Nations for organizing this webinar. As you know, the food security and ensuring efficient production is #1 priority of our country, and we also faced food shortages and supply chain disruptions. And I think we made taken number of measures to ensure comprehensive and adequate solution to this matter. First of all, in foreign trade, the temporary export bans were lifted in June. Second, we introduced new tax cuts and tax exemptions for the businesses. And third, as you mentioned about the food production, the government adopted new plan on the production of social food items until 2023. And I think by that time we'll be fully self-sufficient on social food items. But I must highlight that, as the previous speakers mentioned, that in order to ensure food security, we need to trade, and also we need to ensure that our trade borders are open. So we ensured during the COVID time, we established green corridors between all the countries in the region. And the Kazakhstan acts as a local food hub, and we actually want to position, the new Prime Minister mentioned about that we position ourselves as a new food hub for the region, because all the transport corridors, they intersect and they go through Kazakhstan. And also Kazakhstan is also itself is a major producer of food items. And one of the things I also wanted to mention is about the infrastructure. As you know, there is a big food losses, big losses during the transportation of the food items, as well as during the production. So we want to, our new plan focuses on building infrastructure, that is the agro-logistics hub and wholesale distribution centers, which will act as a focal point, as hubs for the and interact with the different infrastructure in the neighboring countries. And one of the most important things also, the importance of the retail. Kazakhstan, before the pandemic, we had like 40% retailization rate in the country, but we want to increase the organized trade in the region, because we see that the biggest retailers, they were more flexible and more efficient in their response during the COVID times. So overall, summing up, we are open for trade, and we focus on introducing new irrigated lands. And I think we'll position ourselves as a new food hub for the region, and ensure that our trade and interaction, communication during the COVID times will only improve. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mazamat, for those comments. I will now turn back to Tassos. And Tassos, one question that I have for you, considering that the EU is the world's largest importer and one of the world's largest exporters of agricultural products, it is quite clear that trade is very crucial to the European Union. What frictions did the pandemic reveal in cross-border trade that should be urgently addressed to increase the movement of food across countries in the region?
When we talk about the European Union, we need to keep in mind, apart from the fact that the first thing that the European Union is a free trade agreement within it itself, that there are two different dimensions. It's the extra-EU trade and the intra-EU trade. Now, in the intra-EU trade, some of the potential frictions are hinted by the discussion of Alan, but these are frictions that are at a relatively low level, and we find ways of turning them into synergies. We do have a single market, we do have a common policy, and a lot of the support that is given to farmers in different member states is limited not only by the fact that the EU budget is fixed, but also that the national budgets are fixed. I'm not saying that there aren't some that feel more favorable than others, but that is not really a major problem. One of the things that we need to keep in mind in terms of the intra-trade frictions, so one of the side effects, the positive side effects of COVID has been that it gave a major boost in the digitalization of transactions. And that is something that is there to stay and will have a major role in what is happening in the future. In terms of extra trade, what I would like to stress here, and also I'm speaking as part and current chair of the Rapid Response Forum of EMIS, is that when we compare how EMIS started 10 years, a decade ago, as a response to the then food crisis in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and what is happening today, and Massimo showed it clearly, we're talking about a world that has learned the lessons of what is problematic with putting trade barriers. And I think we need to stress that the EU didn't take any measures or hasn't seen much measures that generated frictions. Right now, most of the focus we have in terms of extra trade has a lot to do with the shifting of the debate about the environmental footprint and the climate footprint of the food that is traded, but that is a much bigger issue that will take another panel to discuss and not the current one. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Azamat. The question I have for you is that trade in agriculture products plays a vital role in Kazakhstan. Has the pandemic changed the way you now engage with your trading partners, or will the future be business as usual?
I think that the pandemic changed in terms that it showed the dependence on each other. So we need to focus on cooperation among the Central Asian states. And Kazakhstan has an important location to play as a transit hub for Central Asian countries that's exporting their food items to China as well to Russia. And panelists mentioned about the gastro-nationalism, but I think it's not the case in terms of Kazakhstan. We plan to be open and ensure that there is no supply chain disruptions among ourselves and in the efforts of our partners and trading partners to export their products to Russia as well to China. So basically, it showed that how interdependent and how connected we are. And I think our cooperation in this sector will just only grow and get better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now pose the last question to Alexander. What would you have done sooner at home and with your trading partners if you had a crystal ball and knew that a pandemic was coming? What would you do differently with more experience now that we have acquired a lot of experience with the pandemic? So we'll be glad to know your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I completely agree with our panelists in a point that at the moment trade is, especially when we talk about food, is not a matter of just interest and benefits. It's like a matter of security, because a number of countries depends from supplier from the different regions. At the same time, we reach a number of experience inside the countries as well, and we can observe the change of consumer habits, style, and change from the restaurant and HoReCa consumption to retail and home. And all this information at the moment brings us a new understanding how the supply chains changing in time. So I believe that what we should do is to increasing and boosting the trade, because this is, I believe, in next period will be one of the core and most important thing. At the same time, the revision of supply chains, a revision of production and consumption, because as it was also mentioned that during this year we observed that less animal protein consuming, and only grain trade brings some more or less stable figures in trade statistics, not only but predominantly. And I understand that the pretty important thing will be continue to develop the right communication between players and use all accessible ways of communication. And I again appreciate that WTO keeps a very important role in this communication. So four main things: trade, supply chain, consumption, and communication. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists for presenting your views. I think you have helped shed light on this emerging issue, viewed from very different perspectives. So I'd like to thank you most sincerely for your contribution. I will now turn to the Q&A, and we'll be having questions from the general public. And for that, I turn to Pedro and Yana to pose the questions. So thank you for the two colleagues. If you could now, pose the questions to the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Casey. Good afternoon, dear panelists. Good afternoon, dear participants. This Q&A section will last about 20 minutes, and we are planning to ask about 3-4 questions, depending on the time available. For each speaker, I would ask to have 2-3 minutes to answer, and I would like to kindly ask the speakers to be concise and brief. The first question will be addressed to Mr. Terrero. You showed in your chart that imports and exports behave differently during the pandemic. Does it mean we are experiencing changes in trade flows? Will the shifts have lasting effects? Mr. Terrero, the floor is yours.
We honestly don't know. What we will have lasting effects on our impression is that the economic recession will clearly have an effect over the exports of, in the case of agriculture, of high-value commodities, and also will have an effect, especially in what is meats and fish, and finally also in products that move through airlines, because the cost of transportation of airlines is shared. And as long as the airline service is not resolved and there is no people traveling, the costs are too high. That applies to flowers, applies to high value end products like asparagus, applies to fish, fresh fish, and so on. And that could take more than a year. So yes, it will have some consequences. How much they will depend on how much capacity agro exporters and producers and companies can resist this situation. And the variability between imports and exports is because of the types of commodities and because some countries, especially in the case of cereals, are increasing the level of imports to restock their activities, especially in the case of China and in the case of key net importers of cereals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Terrero. Now let me refer to the audience. We currently have Mr. Volodymyr Lapa, advisor to the president of Ukrainian Agribusiness Club, present with us today. Mr. Lapa, we would like to address your question on the investment in agriculture in the region. Both by the public and the private sector, its figure is low compared to its contribution to GDP. How can the private sector engage with governments so that they both together boost investment in agriculture?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question and for possibility to participate at such high-level discussion. First of all, the key issue from our point of view is communication. We are in communication with the Ukrainian government, and we had a lot of discussion regarding special tools to predict COVID distribution in Ukraine, but with limited damages for business activity. And I guess Ukraine was quite successful and is quite successful in respect to farming sector. As a minimum, we hadn't had any significant limitation. We can survive with COVID, and it was the responsibility of farming business to introduce special tools to predict spreading of disease at the farming level. But I also would like to mention a few issues which is quite important in respect to previous discussion from our point of view, because we understand that in majority cases the precondition for export or for import is inspection, and we understand that during lockdown there was limited possibilities for inspection, and suddenly disease is appearing in farming sector, and that means that during recent time there was limited possibilities to deal with disease, to make inspection, and to save trade. And we had quite good example when we have so-called e-inspection, electronic inspection of different competent authorities here in Ukraine. We had such experience with the European Union and also with Chinese authorities. And I believe that if such a high-level organization as FIO, WTO will deal with it, will stimulate this process, it will provide good possibilities to make this experience more wide and to save trade. And the second scale of this issue is also certification. We've heard about digitalization. For example, in Ukraine, with support of FIO, we work, we competent authority with support of business and FIO work on electronic phyto certification and issue of phytosanitary certificate. That's also important for make proper international trade. But what we see right now, from our point of view, Ukrainian competent authority will be able to do electronic certification in few months, but it will work only in case if majority of countries in the world will accept this certificate. And then that means that the role of international organization in this respect is very important. And I guess we should also communicate and spread this experience to make the world trade stable and proper. And thank you very much again for possibilities to say a few words in this high-level discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lapo, for your insight. The next question I would like to address to Mr. Azamat Askaroli. You said Kazakhstan has vulnerable groups that require food aid. In situation of high food insecurity as this pandemic, how can food vouchers strengthen local food systems? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. We actually have a big project right now connecting the food vouchers to the food producers in our system. We call it the social vouchers. And we have vulnerable groups that are receiving right now the cash inputs from government, and we would like to connect it with the local producers, so they ensure that all the items that they are buying, first of all, safe, locally produced, and second is with the low price. And I think it's a big item that we are working right now as a government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Askaroli. Now I would like to refer to Mr. Zhemoida. You mentioned AMIS as a platform to share information. Beyond AMIS, what responses does a country expect from the UN when it faces food supply disruption caused by pandemics?
Thank you. Actually, it was a great discussion during this year, because normally AMIS is a platform for distribution of the information, changing the data and statistic, and the prediction of the market flows. So during this year, it was pretty important during first part of the year, because sometime in different countries we observed the decision which were made by governments can influence not only to the internal market, but not only to supplier and consumers, but also to the neighboring countries. As I mentioned before, we faced a similar problem during May and June, April, May, and June. And it was like some sort of pressure to how to develop the policy inside the country, not introducing the trade restrictive measures. And in role of AMIS there was also big, because we had regional balances, we had national balances, we saw the situation as the markets, and we understand that there is no any needs to introduce some restrictive measures from the point of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last question goes to Mr. Haniotis. Could you please tell if you consider that SPS constrains the participation of food trade by least developed countries with the EU?
No, I think what the SPS does is it reflects through a process that is based on on science and also on agreements, the standards that people have to meet. I think what is extremely important for exports to the EU is to understand that these are exports that go to a world population whose consumers have specific tastes and preferences. I mean, what makes something profitable is the capacity to understand what are the trends of consumers and try to get some benefit, some value out of it. And exactly because the focus of trade of the EU, both extra and intra, is on value-added products, that generates a lot of capacity to developing countries to export products, in the process of which they also reap benefits in terms of the introduction of new technologies. And there's plenty of studies that indicate that overall this is beneficial. That doesn't mean that there are not specific problems in different parts of the world, including in the European Union, about SPS standards. But if we look at the big picture, I think the opportunities that have been created and the benefits by far outweigh any potential problems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haniotis. Thank you very much all the speakers for your answers. Although we have many additional questions from the audience, unfortunately, we cannot raise them all because of the time constraints. And now let me pass the floor back to Mr. Casey for wrap-up and conclusions.
Thank you very much, Yana. I think we all agree that we have been able to cover a wide ground in terms of the quality of the presentations made by our speakers and also by the panelists. And so I'd like to thank you most profusely for the presentations that you have made. I think this topic is very important, although we did focus on the impact of COVID in the European region. However, the lessons are not only unique to that region, I think all parts of the world. So I'm very happy that we did have participants from all over the world. And I think the conclusions and the debate, the discussions, the issues which were raised would also be relevant in other regions as well. I think this is a very lively topic. And as I said, we all don't know the trajectory of the pandemic. It's still ongoing, but I think we have learned lessons, and I think our panelists and speakers have laid bare the sort of policy measures which we need to take. So I think we have a lot to chew on, and then I think policymakers from all regions of the world, particularly from this region, would implement the policy measures which would ensure security in food production and food trade. So once again, I'd like to thank our colleagues from the FAO, from the WTO, ULA, my other colleagues for having worked very hard to make this possible. And, you know, we hope that we can still engage on this issue. From the WTO perspective, if there are any questions from the floor that you would like to address to us, please do not hesitate and we will respond to your questions. So with these few words, I'd like to bring it to a close. And I think I'll hand over to my colleagues from FAO if they'd like to add something before we finally close this webinar. So thanks very much.